John Howard, great to talk to you again. Welcome to Chris Kenny Tonight.
Thank you.
Now, less than 10 years ago, there were Liberal governments, coalition governments, federally and right across the whole of the country except for South Australia. After tomorrow, it's likely there won't be a Liberal government on the Australian mainland. How quickly the worm turns.
Politics is about change, and we have gone through those periods, and I hope that there will still be a Liberal government in New South Wales. It's going to be very tight, and I'd be less than honest if I didn't say that. And it's something that, to his credit, Dom Perrottet has acknowledged. It's very hard after you've been in power for 12 years to get re-elected again, but I think the advantage he has is that he's won the fundamental debate on economic management. He really has won that hands down.
When you think about that change in the political landscape, though, does that suggest that the political cycle is irresistible?
I don't think you can ever discount the political cycle. Whether it's irresistible, I think that will depend on circumstances, but there are always separate explanations. There was a separate reason why the Liberal Party was routed in Western Australia a couple of years ago. There's reasons why the party did poorly in Victoria. There was a reason why it lost after only one term in South Australia, although I thought Stephen Marshall ran the South Australian economy extremely well.
Well, we'll come to some of those other reasons in a moment, but I want to talk about pandemic politics. It seems that Labor governments have been rewarded for tough responses to the pandemic, but Liberal governments and our oppositions, I suppose, you're looking at them in Western Australia, but Liberal government in South Australia, as you talk about, they've been punished for pandemic responses. Is it a case that perhaps the huge amounts of deficit spending during the pandemic, the onerous restrictions on business and personal liberties, were they perhaps seen as an attack on the Liberal Party base?
I think what happened in South Australia, and you quote that as one example, the change there was due to other factors, in my opinion. I think the pandemic was part of it. I think the impression that the officials were running the show rather than the politicians was a factor, but I think an even greater factor was the apparent factional disunity in the Liberal Party, and I've been fairly vocal on this and I'll continue to be so, because parties that demonstrate division and factionalism, particularly in government, are rarely rewarded.
But that brings us back to New South Wales and the election this weekend. Surely there's been too much factional warfare in New South Wales within the Liberal Party, and it's deeply affected their ability to even pre-select candidates on time for elections. I
think there's been some, but what is dominating the campaign, in my opinion, in New South Wales is the way in which Dominic Perrottet, who started, in my opinion, behind, has recovered quite brilliantly during the campaign. He's won the economic case hands down. Let me give you an example. The major pitch of Chris Minns is that he's going to lift the cap on public sector wages. And public sector wages is 40% of the New South Wales budget. Well, when you say, I'm going to lift the cap, what you're really saying is, I'm going to lift your wages. But when it comes to actually acknowledging that, he doesn't do so. When he put his costings in, he put zero beside the cost of lifting the cap. And when taxed on that, he said, oh, well, I'll find savings elsewhere, maybe in infrastructure. Well, even Perrottet's fiercest critics admit that infrastructure spending by the coalition in this state has been fantastic over the last few years. The public transport's much better. Travel by road is much better. I just know, as somebody who, who traverses the roads to the outer part of Sydney quite regularly, I understand just how much an effect that is. So I think what I've got to say to Chris Minns, well, if you're promising the hundreds of thousands of public sector employees, in effect, we're going to lift your wages, you've got to say what's that going to cost? And you've got to say, where's the money coming from?
Well, exactly. The public sector unions will see that as an open check.
Of course they will.
So it could play out terribly.
You can't pretend that when you say to people, and you're talking to hundreds of thousands of employees, you can't pretend when you say we're going to lift the cap, that's not code for saying we're going to give you more money. Well, if you're going to give them more money, where's it coming from? And he hasn't explained that. And I think it blows an enormous hole in his economic credibility.
Well, the other point you mentioned with Chris Minns and Labor is this anti-privatisation stand. Now, anybody who's travelling around anywhere in New South Wales and Sydney sees this enormous infrastructure going into place, and it is wonderful. There are no critics. It's really modernising the state. Most of that's been paid for by privatisation. So how is Chris Minns going to continue the upgrades of infrastructure if he's just going to fund it off annual budgets?
Well, the answer is he won't. And the answer will be if he wins, he will find savings elsewhere, or he'll take a leaf out of Mr Albanese's book and start lifting taxes. I mean, something's got to give. Remember there was a wonderful movie that had that title, and something's got to give. And you've got all this extra expenditure, both at a state and federal level. In the end, it's got to be paid for. So the first responsibility on anybody, particularly somebody who wants to be the premier of the largest state in Australia, is to actually say where the money's coming from, and he hasn't done that.
Now, have the Liberals in New South Wales given up on one of the core tenets of the Liberal Party, that is to be the party of small government? They've thrown out all sorts of rebates. There's vouchers for kids' sport. There's vouchers for creative endeavours with kids. There's a back-to-school voucher. There's rebates on energy. There's rebates on tolls. And now there's even a government-funded super savings account for children. Isn't this an illiberal agenda of big government?
I wouldn't call it illiberal. I mean, certainly you can pick on this, that or the other and say that's unnecessary. I think the kids fund is a good policy, and it's really modest. You're talking about $400 a year for a child, and it's something about the future.
But that's if the parents put in, and the Howard Battler families with 3 kids, they won't be able to find $3,000 a year to put in so they get the government contribution.
That's the maximum. I mean, the government will match up to $400, and a lot of those aspiring Battler families will be able to contribute. Some of them won't, but that is the case always. But there will be a lot of families that would love to be part of this, particularly if their contributions are matched by the government.
What about energy? Matt Keane is as green on energy and as committed to net zero as just about any politician in the country. Has the coalition in New South Wales failed the state and the country by pushing too far down this road? They're anti-coal, anti-gas.
Well, I don't know that the coalition is anti-coal and anti-gas.
They want to get rid of coal-fired generation, and Matt Keane's been very antagonistic about gas-fired generation as well.
I don't get that quite as you do. I mean, I have to say that when it comes to the climate change push, I am becoming an increasing sceptic. I'm not sure that I go along with the prevailing worldwide consensus. I think we have very precious assets in coal and gas in this country, and that I think we should continue to benefit from what Providence gave us. And I'm also a very strong supporter of moving towards nuclear power generation. It's part of the future. We have 38% of the easily recoverable uranium reserves in this country. Most of them, I think, are in your home state of South Australia, but we're talking nationally on this particular point, and I'm in favour of it. Now, in that sense, I think I speak for a growing number of Australians, and my prediction is that in a few years' time, the debate on energy will have shifted.
Yeah, if you want emissions-free energy, then obviously nuclear is the answer. Is it enough now just to get rid of the legislative impediments, or should we be going full bore to actually get some nuclear generation online in this country?
Well, I think the first thing is to get rid of the prohibition. And when we were last in government, I did have an inquiry carried out as to what might be done, and I think the smartest thing that Anthony Albanese could do in relation to energy policy is pick up the phone to Peter Dutton and say, let's work together to bring nuclear energy as a generational source online, because there are only 2 ways you can get baseload power. You go through fossil fuels, that's coal and gas, or nuclear energy. And I'm not saying that as John Howard, any expert. That was the formal advice I had from both the chief scientist and CSIRO when I was Prime Minister. And I'm sure in 15 years that advice would be the same.
Two other matters unrelated to New South Wales election and those issues I just want to run past you firstly. That is, we've seen the Voice wording come out today. Anthony Albanese releasing the referendum question and the clauses that would change the Constitution. Aren't the benefits of an Indigenous voice, the potential benefits of an Indigenous voice towards practical reconciliation in this country so great that they overwhelm the rather minuscule risks of legal or constitutional problems?
Chris, I don't think those risks are minuscule. Only 2-3 years ago, the High Court decided that if somebody had Indigenous heritage, even though that person lived overseas, was citizen of another country, could not be deported as an alien from Australia. Now, if a High Court can make that decision on the existing Constitution, what might it do with the powers that it would get under this referendum? Can I say, I am in favour of constitutional recognition of Indigenous people, but the recognition I would like to see is in the preamble, where, and I think the preamble should simply state an undeniable truth that the first occupants of this country were the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, I think if we said that and left it at that, 90% of the community would vote for it because it's undeniably true. But when you are talking about a body that can make recommendations to every part of the federal government and the potential for those recommendations being litigated if they're rejected, I think you've gone into a new constitutional quagmire.
I'm aware of the Love decision that you referred to. It looked like High Court overreach to me.
Well,
but that's an argument never to change the Constitution.
Beg your pardon?
But that's an argument never to change the Constitution.
No,
these changes look very, very sensible and minimalist, and they've certainly won support from former Chief Justices of the High Court.
Well, it's won support from some former Chief Justices. There's also many other former judges of the High Court who've argued against it, and Greg Craven, somebody who supports the Voice, said that the form announced by Mr Albanese a day or so ago is about the worst possible form, and he's somebody who supports the Voice concept. You have to proceed very carefully, and in the end, isn't it the responsibility of state and territory and federal governments to provide the services that... And I remember 15 years ago when we launched the intervention in the Northern Territory, my government did, because the Northern Territory government had failed in its responsibilities. I don't think a lot has changed over that 15-year period. It was after all the failure of the Northern Territory government in relation to the grog bans that produced the understandable concern about the breakdown and the lawlessness in Alice Springs quite recently, and there's already some tentative sign that with the return of the grog ban, things have got a little better. Now, it's not just a question of banning alcohol, but it's a question of fixing governments with their responsibilities. And in the end, the things that distress us most can be best remedied by proper action by the governments that have the responsibility.
From this distance, do you see the Voice referendum failing or succeeding?
Well, I think people will multiply their concerns as time goes by. It's taken a long time to get the final form. I welcome the fact that it's arrived. I think support for it will continue to drop. What will happen will be determined by the Australian people and by people arguing the case. And I hope it's a sensible argument, an argument that is not put in some kind of moral context. And in the end, we all want a better thing, a better life for Indigenous people. I think it is a great blemish on our history that we haven't done more as a nation. But I don't think you solve that deficiency by putting some words in the Constitution. You solve that deficiency by governments in a very pragmatic, bit-by-bit, local way, helping Aboriginal families, intervening when necessary, on other occasions letting those people on the spot make their decisions.
John Howard, thanks so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Always great to talk to John Howard. Fascinating insights there on The Voice. I would say, though, those words in the Constitution could help Indigenous people give governments the feedback and ideas to deliver those practical outcomes. But as he says, that is the debate we will engage in over coming months. Fantastic to catch up with the former Prime Minister John Howard.